The great St. Augustine, in one of his homilies in the 4th century, said something that was surprising, probably disturbing, and certainly had his listeners wondering what he meant. In that homily, he said, "Love and do what you will. Love and do what you will." And I'm sure there were people who were listening to him who wanted to stand up and say, "Augustine, that makes us just like the pagans." And he would have said, "I mean something a little different by the word love." In the second reading, Paul speaks to that point when he says the only debt we should owe each other is the debt to love one another. And why is it a debt? It's because Jesus told us, love God, love your neighbor. The one commandment with two parts that are equal. So Paul is saying, if we act out of concern for our neighbor, then we don't have to worry about the commandments that tell us not to kill or steal or commit adultery. We would never do that. We would never harm anyone that we are trying to love. It just doesn't work that way for us humans. So Paul is saying, if you act according to the law of loving your neighbor, then do what you will. So what does this love mean? What is it? What are we talking about here? We're supposed to love our neighbor. What if we don't like our neighbor? Could happen. Love is an action verb, as some have said. It doesn't have to do with thinking a certain way. It doesn't have to do with feeling a certain way. It's not about being a nice person. It goes way beyond that. So when we love our neighbor, it doesn't have anything to do with how we feel at the moment. A good example would be in the story of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritans didn't love their neighbors, the Jews, at all, and it was reciprocal. So when this Good Samaritan sees this injured Jew lying by the side of the road, he might have felt animosity or disgust, or who knows. But you know what? He took care of him anyway. Not just took care of him, went out of his way to take care of him. I'm looking at these ASP folks, and I'm thinking, wow, what a great mass to come to for this particular homily. Because here are people who've been spending the last month? A week? Month? So here they are, who have been willing the good of their neighbor and doing it, and probably some days they haven't felt much like it, but they did it anyway. That could be the end of my homily right there. Bishop Robert Barron defines love as willing the good of the neighbor, the good of the other, and then doing it. So it doesn't have anything to do with what I'm going to get back for myself from it. It doesn't have to do with being thanked. It's really what we owe our neighbor according to the law of love. You know, and sometimes it might not even look like love. I can think of times when my children were growing up, and sometimes we had to have some difficult conversations I'm sure that's never occurred to you. And I'm sure from my children's point of view, it didn't feel much like love as they understood it. But I was hoping for something good to come out of the conversation. Most of the time, I think it did. But it might have taken a while. So even if we don't want particularly to love our neighbor in this way, it's the gold standard of how we're supposed to act. Love God, love your neighbor. Probably that's one of the ways we're going to be judged sometime. So I think it's always important, though, to include prayer as part of this process. Help me, Lord. Help me, Lord, to desire good for this person, even though I don't really want to. Help me desire good. And if this person has injured me in some way, heal me of any thoughts of revenge, getting back at them, damaging their reputation. Don't let me do that. Help me act with love, Lord, with charity, no matter what I'm feeling. The first reading and the gospel both talk about this in different ways. Ezekiel, the prophet, like all the prophets, was appointed to be a watch person for Israel, to warn them when they were doing wrong, to let them know that God would not be happy with them if they continued along that path. And the prophets mostly got nothing but hardship and insults, death threats, and some of them were killed for speaking that difficult truth that was a kind of tough love, always given to the people in the hopes that they would be converted. So the prophets always had the good of their listeners in mind. In the gospel, Jesus is talking about what do you do when somebody offends you. Now, the context in the gospel has to do with a congregation. Could have been in the synagogue or it could have been in the churches later on. But if someone offends you as a member of the congregation, don't do what most people automatically would do, and that is strike out, strike back, or complain to somebody else, or try and destroy that person's reputation. No, instead, go to that person, and in charity, point out to them how they've hurt you. And maybe that's enough to win them over. And if not, bring some witnesses. And if that still doesn't work, bring the whole church into it. And if the person still doesn't change, then they would be separated from the community, which is a pretty tough punishment. But even that's not the end of the day. They could still repent and come back. When you complain, when we complain about somebody, that builds up a whole negativity in the community, doesn't it? I mean, now someone is thinking this person may not be such a good person. Others will support them. So we get division cropping up that all starts with a negative reaction. But if we respond as Jesus suggests, in a charitable way, and going to them to bring good out of the relationship, then just the opposite happens. Now we've got good vibes. Now we're bringing people back together. Now we're building the community. And Jesus reminds us, he's always there. Whenever 2 or 3 of us are praying for something, he's always there in our midst. Strengthen us and guide us. because it's not easy. Anybody that's had to correct someone, and most of us have done that from time to time, whether it's a child or a peer or a parent or a neighbor, is found it to be difficult. So we need to be clear about what good we're planning to bring out of this conversation. Don't just jump into it blindly. And then pray. The good news is that acting this way, as you guys know very well, is a very powerful way of acting. The most powerful way of acting. Love and do what you will is a great witness to the world of the power of love. Love so great and so strong that it can fix this broken world of ours. Love is indeed the strongest force on earth. So use it, and use it well.